and welcome back to the Fantasy Football Profits YouTube page. I'm Christian Skutovic, your host, joined here with analyst and writer Robert Skutovic. If you want to win your fantasy league, if you want to take your fantasy game to the next level, you need to keep watching this video. We have a lot of great advice in this video. We're really excited about this one and done a lot of research and preparation, because today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest and most prominent fantasy mistakes that you have to avoid if you want to do well year in and year out. First, we'd like to clarify that there are other mistakes. We're not going to hit on every little tiny error that people occasionally make. We're going to talk about the big ones, the ones that hurt you the most, the ones that can crush your season in one little move. So Rob, why don't you get started with your first mistake?
Okay, well, before I do that, I just want to reiterate what you said, Christian. You don't have to be a stat geek or spend hour upon hour studying to win or be successful at fantasy football. Here's some basic common mistakes to avoid. My first mistake that I see happen all the time: if you want to be successful, check your emotions at the door. I grew up in Minnesota. I'm a Vikings fan, and almost every Vikings fan hates who, Christian?
Green Bay Packers.
The Green Bay Packers. They hate the Packers. I've seen that bias drive fantasy owners to make so many mistakes. Sometimes that bias can be played out in the fact that you're blind to the fact that maybe your own team isn't that good of a fantasy team to play from. I'll give you an example. Back in the day, I remember how many Vikings fans drafted Christian Ponder. I mean, let's get real for a second there. It sounds like he's a great guy, but honestly, there was never a point in his career that he was honestly a fantasy option. And yet, how many Vikings fans did that? Another way I saw a lot of negative bias play out, or negative or hurtful bias in terms of fantasy football, was Tim Tebow. Now, being a Christian and specifically a pastor myself, I like Tim Tebow. I think he's a great guy. I think that he's a versatile athlete. But how many drank the Tim Tebow Kool-Aid and drafted him? I saw my daughter, for example, love Tim Tebow. You know that, Christian.
Yeah.
Bought his jersey, loved the guy. Year after year, she would have him as her quarterback and a backup quarterback and just waste bench space because of her bias and her like for Tim Tebow. I've also seen the opposite, where not only is that bias can blind you and you can pick players from your favorite team that aren't that good, quite honestly, but you can also avoid players and other teams that you don't like. And I'll give you an example. My very first year I played fantasy football, I actually went on to win the league. I'm sure it was a combination of hopefully success. Hopefully I knew what I was doing, but I'm sure a lot of it was luck. But the first year in the league, I didn't really have a lot of bias. I tried to go in there and just look at stats and numbers. And a lot of Vikings fans were in that draft. And so they stayed away from a young quarterback, okay, a little-known quarterback named Brett Favre. And I didn't mind taking him. I didn't care who he played for, so I took him late in the draft. That allowed me to stock up on my running backs, my wide receivers. I took him, I think he was like the 10th or 12th quarterback taken in that draft. He goes on to throw 33 touchdown passes, and I win the league. Once again, they were so biased. They just did not want to draft him because he was a Packer fan. You know what? I don't care what team you play for. I don't care if you play for the Packers, if you're an arch rival. If you're going to help me win my fantasy league, I'm going to take you. Once again, make sure to check your emotions at the door. The other thing I see a lot in terms of emotions, I don't know how many times I've heard people say at a draft, I won't draft that player because he burnt me last year. Or they'll draft that player again because he did well for them last year. Well, number one, what they did for you or didn't do for you last year is irrelevant. Loyalty has nothing to do with it. Okay, these guys didn't know that you drafted him and honestly could care less. So when it comes to drafting a player, put aside how well he did or didn't do for you last year. Strictly look at the numbers, look at the situations, evaluate it. Put your bias aside, put your emotions aside. Another time I saw, and Christian, you're actually a part of this one, a bias. A couple years ago, Stefon Diggs comes into the league, and he has about 4 games where he just gets hot. And in our league, people were looking for some extra talent to pick up. It was a keeper league, we had salary cap, so we had to bid on players. Now our salary cap was $200 that you can spend on your team. And he was a free agent, Stefon Diggs. And there's 3 guys in our league, all Minnesota Vikings fans. They got into a bidding war. When it was all said and done, they paid for over $100 for this guy.
$117.
$117. It's insane. And so once again, the bias got in their way there. So, do you have a favorite team? Do you have a favorite player? You know, I think that's great. I do. Buy their jersey, root them on Sunday morning to win. When it comes to fantasy football, you've got to put your emotions, okay, aside. You got to check them at the door, come in, look at the numbers. My wife actually has had a lot of success in fantasy, and quite honestly, I think it's because she doesn't know quite as much about football, and so for her, she simply looks at the numbers. Anything to add to that, Christian?
Yeah, not only you see people with bias, Rob, it's hilarious. Some people brag about their bias. There was a guy a couple of years ago bragged because it was his fourth year in a row drafting Jay Cutler. That is the stupidest bias ever. Jay Cutler a couple years ago may have been a good fantasy quarterback or whatever, and maybe you just happen to get him 4 years in a row, but he's bragging about it. And some people almost they're almost proud of it.
Was he a Chicago fan?
He was not a Chicago fan. He just had a weird thing for Jay Cutler, I guess.
Weird thing for Jay Cutler, yeah. Yeah, I gotta say, put your bias aside, check your emotions at the door. I don't care where you are, what they've done, what fan you are, what your favorite team is. Once again, if you want to win, you got to put the emotions aside.
And one more thing to that. Let's be honest, we all have bias. Let's not pretend we don't have bias. You have to be really honest with yourself and sit down. What players do I like and not like? And like I said, you just have to be honest with yourself. I think it's really foolish to pretend like, oh, I don't have that much bias, or I don't struggle with being biased towards or against players. And we do. I do. You do. We starting to notice as we were looking into our rankings, wow, I ranked this guy kind of high a couple years in a row. Maybe I'm biased. And then you look into it and find out, yeah, maybe I should bump him down a bit. So that's just something you got to be really honest with yourself if you want to do well. Check your emotions at the door if you want to win. All right, my first fantasy mistake, and this is more of a mistake you see people who don't know much about fantasy football or in their first league or just did a lack of preparation. You see this in a lot of people's first drafts of the year. Not having a backup plan. I see people come into drafts and do the dumbest thing. They're like, you know what? I have the fourth pick and I want this guy. I'm going to get him. And then you know what happens? Somebody takes him before them and they panic and they make a bad pick. And here's a perfect example of that. Last year I was in a league and two guys really wanted to get Rob Gronkowski. And so one guy took him early in the second round. And right after him was another guy who wanted Rob Gronkowski. And he thought, I'm going to draft him in the second round. Nobody will take a tight end that early. All of a sudden, the tight end goes before him and he panics. It's the second round. It's early in the second round. There's lots of talent. But the guy he wanted is gone. He freaks out and he drafts Sammy Watkins. That's a horrible pick. That was a terrible early second round pick. That was, just a severe lack of preparation and immaturity on his part. So you know what? Pick players that you like. Research. Find guys who you think are going to be good. Highlight them. Get ready to pick them. But have a backup plan. You're not going to get all the players that you want. It's just foolish to think that you're going to get every guy that's good out there. And you got anything more to say to that, Rob, or are you going to go to your next one?
Well, I'd say what I agree. One of my points was actually going to play right off that, and that's, what? When you go into the draft, there's two mistakes you can make. One is having no draft strategy. Strategy. Or being too rigid in your strategy during the draft. And so one, you got to have a strategy going in. There's a few things you can do. Watch mock drafts. If you're in a dynasty league, for example, I'm in 2 dynasty leagues, I like to look ahead of time. Is this a quarterback-heavy draft? But lack solid running backs. I take a look at who's kept, who's not kept, what my needs are. So by the time I get into the draft, I have a pretty good idea what's out there, what's available, what my needs are. That really helps. If I don't take a look at that, the bigger picture, I'm going to go in a little blind. So once again, have a strategy there going into it. I looked in one draft recently. We headed into it, and I noticed that 10 other teams had protected their quarterback. I didn't. So it was a 12-team league. That means only 2 more teams need a quarterback. And so I realized first couple rounds, I can load up on some other players. I don't have to take my quarterback right away. Once again, I think that if I hadn't paid attention, I could have made the error of grabbing a quarterback too early. Another thing I would say, too, in terms of having a draft strategy. Remember one of the first drafts I was in, Randy Moss was a rookie. Now, his rookie year, he had a great season. He had 1,000 yards, 17 TDs. But this goes back also to that bias. But there was a lady there she drafted, and she took Randy Moss in the first round. Now, he went on to have a great year, and some would say that was a good pick. But I think that was a horrible pick, and here's why. She could have easily got him later. A lot of people expected he was going to be the third wideout because they had Chris Carter and they had Jake Reed, who both had come off 1,000-yard seasons. And they anticipated that Randy Moss was going to maybe be the third wide receiver for a while, and so he could have slipped maybe probably 3rd, 5th, maybe even down to the 8th round. And then she could have loaded up her team. And so once again, she had no strategy. She wanted Randy Moss. She went for it. She hadn't thought it out. That was a terrible mistake.
Yeah, you know what they say, even a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while.
That's true. That's absolutely true. The funny thing was that was a great pick, but her team was really actually a terrible team, and she didn't do very well. The other thing I would say is you got to stay flexible in the draft. When you get to draft, you'll notice there'll be ebbs and there'll be flows and trends within each draft. They're going to vary depending upon the type of draft, your rules, who you're with. You really got to notice that ebb and flow as the draft goes on. You got to be flexible. And that happened to me last year. Now, I'm a guy that I'm not going to take my quarterback early. Okay, I'm going to load up on running backs and wide receivers typically is what I'm going to do. And I'll even take my third or fourth wide receiver or my third or fourth running back before I'll grab maybe even my quarterback at times or definitely my kicker. But I was at this point in my draft last year, came to me and there was like 5 or 6 receivers that I wanted, and they were all out there. And they fell into that kind of same tier, that same level of talent. So I didn't know who I wanted, but I looked, and Gostkowski, the number 1 kicker, was out there. So what do? Well, here's what I did. Unlike normal drafts, I took Gostkowski with the idea that of those 5 or 6 wideouts, one of those will be there when it comes back to me, and then I can show up and have a solid kicker. And sure enough, that's exactly what I did. I took Gostkowski, and sure enough, one of those receivers was available when it came back to me. And so once again, it required me to be flexible. If I was too rigid entering the draft, if I said I will never take a kicker in such and such a round, I think I would have hindered myself. Once again, have a strategy, but be flexible. I agree with your point there, Christian.
Yeah, and my next huge mistake plays right off of yours that you mentioned it, is the mistake of not knowing draft trends. A lot of times you go into a league and they're going to draft something heavy. They're going to draft wide receiver heavy or rookie heavy or quarterback heavy or running back heavy. It doesn't matter what. Whenever you come into a league, whatever league it is, they're going to draft something a little bit heavier than everything else. They're going to be kind of weighted in one area. And here's a really great example of that really hurt us. You and I came into a league that had 12, well, one year it had 16 teams, but one year it only had 12 when we first came in, and we didn't really know how any of these people were going to draft. We didn't know what kind of philosophies they had, and we like to wait on quarterbacks. But you know what? We waited a little bit too long, and I'm pretty sure we both got stuck with like 19 or 20th ranked quarterbacks because it was the 4th round and everyone was drafting their second QB. It was insane. Now that allowed us to capitalize and load up on all our other positions, and we did just fine. But that's just an example. You really have to know who you're drafting with and what they like.
No, I remember that draft. You're absolutely right. In most drafts that I'm in, when you play with veteran players, they're not going to take their backup quarterback early. They're going to wait. A lot of them won't even draft a backup quarterback at all. So when everybody got their quarterback, I remember thinking, okay, I can wait for a while. But then all of a sudden, there was a run on backup quarterbacks. And you could just tell it was inexperienced by the league. The bottom line left me kind of scrambling a little bit, left you in the same position. And I just think, once again, you got to know your trends, your ebbs, your flows. You got to know the people you're drafting with.
Yeah, and well, was it? There was a team that year had 3 quarterbacks, and what do you get? You get 4 bench spots in that league. You only get 4 bench spots, which is absurdly small. And this person is making 2 backup quarterbacks. Half their bench is on quarterbacks, and we're sitting in the 6th round, and they're all gone, and we're like scrambling to find just anyone who could maybe throw a touchdown that week. And you know what, like I said, we did well, but we learned a lot, and the next year we kind of maybe took quarterbacks just a little bit earlier, but once again, we didn't freak out, we didn't panic and draft one right away as we saw they were going, as we have that philosophy of waiting on quarterbacks. But that's just something to keep in mind. Know who you're drafting with, know draft trends. Really important. What about you, Rob? What's your next piece of advice that you must avoid mistakes?
Here is an important piece of advice. It's simple, but don't leave dead weight on your bench. Okay, I've seen this so many times. People will actually have a good draft, they have a good team. They'll start the year maybe even 2-0 and 3-0, and they don't pay any attention to free agents because they feel like they're set. First of all, you can never have enough talent on your bench. One, you want a talented bench. You never know you're going to have injuries, bye weeks. Second, I'd rather have that guy on my bench so I don't have to face him later on, and it keeps that talent off their team. And so once again, you can never, ever have enough talent on your bench. Stay active in free agents. Always look to improve your bench. Now, early on when I played fantasy football, we didn't have the internet. You didn't have a lot of what we had today in terms of free agency. And one of the things back then that was a rule that I don't hear a lot of today was they used to limit our drops and pickups through the year. You could have like 8. Now, when you counted in bye weeks or injuries or things like that, it was very important to be careful about not using them too fast. But nowadays, almost every league is unlimited drops and pickups. And so once again, that's not an issue. And I remember a couple years ago, I probably should have followed my own advice, and I didn't, to my own detriment. Once again, it just shows why you need to have a good bench and how quickly things can take a 180-degree turn. I go into the weekend, I've got Jamal Charles, Le'Veon Bell, I've got the best running backs in the league. I am not worried, okay? Nobody can touch my running backs. They both got injured on the same weekend, out for long stretches. Suddenly, I go from having the best running backs to scrambling to find even a starting running back. And yet the weeks prior to that, I remember eyeing up a couple running backs out there in free agency that I thought about picking up and putting on my bench, and I didn't. Once again, don't leave dead weight on your bench. Stay active, improve your talent. Okay? So important. It's a simple thing to do, but trust me, you're going to need it.
Yeah, and another thing, when you have that talent on your bench, you're able to trade. Gives you a lot of trade bait, and it gives you a lot that you can work with if you need a playoff push, or if you're in a keeper league. You know me, I'm in a keeper league with you, Rob. What do I do a lot in the offseason? I love to trade. So I will scrap together some talent. I'll take 2, 3, 4 guys, put them together, and combine and get that one star player that I need. But I can't do that without depth. So, if you're just leaving some dead weight on your bench, it's easy to do. It's easy to get complacent, miss a week of drops and pickups, or think, he's going to break out. He's going to break out, and almost be too patient with the guy.
Yeah, I've loaded up my bench with talented players. I have been in 2 keeper leagues. I have been for years. And a lot of the talent that I have are guys that I picked up via free agency. In fact, a couple years ago it happened when Odell Beckham Jr. came in the league. Most teams didn't draft him. He had a hamstring injury. He didn't look necessarily great in the preseason. There's some question marks as a rookie. And so he went undrafted. Well, quickly I kept an eye on this guy and I threw him on my bench. And then sure enough, years later, he's still on my bench. I've kept him, obviously. He's a dynasty wide receiver I'm not going to let go. And it was simply me picking him up in free agency because a lot of people overlooked him. And so, once again.
That's a great point. He wasn't the only guy like that. Le'Veon Bell is a guy that you had picked up before he was drafted. You had him in his breakout season. He wasn't drafted a lot of times. Matt Ryan went undrafted in a lot of leagues last year, or at least drafted late. So, that's just the thing. There's talent out in free agency. You just got to be aggressive to get it.
Got to be aggressive. And that's the other point, be aggressive. I have noticed that people are getting more and more desperate once the season starts to find fill-ins. And so if you have an inkling that you think a guy might become a good, solid player for you, or that he maybe have some breakout potential, if you wait that extra week, he's not going to be there. And so you got to snatch that guy up. You got to take some chances. But once again, don't leave dead weight on your bench. Big mistake.
This video is flowing perfectly because this plays really well into my next point. This one is you have to take risks, especially in a keeper league. If you want to find those stars for years, you got to take risks. But also, you got to take risks in any league for a guy to break out and be that final piece to the puzzle. But you have to take smart risks. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of an example where I loaded up and added a lot of depth at one position, and everyone thought it was dumb, but it ended up working out for me really well in the end. There was a league I drafted running back heavy last year. I took Peterson and Melvin Gordon with my first couple of picks really early on in the draft. And a lot of people said, okay, you're done. He's expected me to draft wideouts and quarterbacks and other things for quite a while, but suddenly the 5th round or 6th round, somewhere around there came around, and Jordan Howard was out there. And you know what? Maybe I probably could have even gotten him later in this league, so maybe I drafted him a little bit early because I know he probably was going to go undrafted in that league, but I felt something about him, so I drafted Jordan Howard in that league. Sure enough, Adrian Peterson gets hurt, Howard steps up, and what happens? He becomes a great starter for me and helps me to get the best record in that league. That was a risk because you only have 4 bench spots in that league. And I already have my 2 starting running backs. And at that point I had when I drafted Jordan Howard, I only had 1 wideout. I didn't have my quarterback, my kicker, or my defense. And a lot of people kind of looked at me like, you're drafting your 3rd running back already? But that was a risk that really paid off. Sometimes, especially at the running back position, you got to just gamble. You got to throw a spot on the guy who could just turn out to be something. What do you think about that, Rob?
Yeah, definitely. If you know my philosophy, I definitely load up on running backs and wide receiver talent. I don't worry as much about some of those other positions. Year after year, it's helped me so much to have those extra players on there, whether it be productivity or injuries. Once again, you got to be willing to take that risk. If you play close to the sleeve, they say, if you play close to the chest, usually it's going to come back and haunt you. You got to be willing to take some chances if you want to win it all.
Yeah, that's a really great point. What's your next point, I believe?
Here's my next point. If you want to be successful at fantasy football, forget about the bye weeks and the playoffs during the draft. I don't know how many times I've seen. Now, once again, things have changed. When I was in the playing fantasy football back in the 80s and early 90s, you only had a certain amount of pickups. We didn't have computers, and so you would often draft your backup quarterback, so on and so forth, things like that. But right now, I would say that's definitely a mistake. Don't do that. One, think about the playoffs. I have to laugh when I hear a guy and he's drafting and he picks a player and he's got a great schedule weeks 14, 15, and 16. Okay? First of all, let's put the brakes on there, buddy. You need to get to the postseason, so let's not worry about his playoff schedule week 1. 2, forget about the bye weeks. Okay? Think about the year that Odell Beckham came out. You could have had Nick Novak, maybe your backup kicker, on your bench, but quite honestly, there's going to be other options out there, guys, that you can pick up for 1 week that you can fill in. And wouldn't it be better to have Odell Beckham on your bench? Or a guy like him that maybe can break out or be a successful filler, like you said, a Jordan Howard. So once again, let's not worry about the bye weeks, week 1, 2, or 3. Don't worry about the playoff schedules. Draft the best talent available. Load your team up. The draft weeks will take care of themselves. In fact, what I would say is oftentimes the very guys that you take as your backups for the bye weeks, when the bye weeks actually come, oftentimes they're not even the best option out there. There's a reason why that quarterback slipped to 18, 19, and 20 in the draft. So once again, don't do that. Don't focus on your playoffs too early. Here's when you can begin to think about your playoff roster. If you're about a couple weeks out, 2 to 3 weeks out, and you feel like you've shored up a playoff spot, that's when you can begin to tweak and look ahead and adjust your lineup accordingly. But don't do it ahead of time. Once again, you got to win the games now. Don't worry about it too early. Christian, what's your next mistake?
All right, my next mistake. You see a lot of guys, they're developing in fantasy, and a good example is Justin O'Connor. I'm going to pick on you a little bit. Hopefully you're watching this. You're starting to get into fantasy. You're starting to get a lot better. And you know what? I'm very proud. You're starting to make a lot of fantasy moves. You're starting to pick up a lot of guys. You're starting to trade a lot. You're starting to be aggressive, doing everything that you can to make playoffs and win a fantasy league. But I've seen people be too aggressive. Do not overmanage your team. If you think you have a guy on your bench that has talent, give him a week or 2. Wait. If you have that backup, you're waiting. Rob, you talked about it earlier, that Allen Hurns. You had talent. You had the guy that year. Allen Robinson.
Allen Robinson, yeah.
Both had good years that year, but yeah, mix them up a little bit.
I was huge on Allen Robinson. That's a great point. I talked him up big. I pointed him out to others. I drafted him. And about the second or third weekend, I got impatient. He wasn't producing maybe the way that I thought he would, and so I dropped him, picked up another guy, and then sure enough, somebody else snatched him up, and then the rest was history. He goes on to get on fire and has a great second year.
Even worse than that is do not overtrade yourself. Many years ago, back when Darren McFadden was kind of the darling pick, everybody was really excited about him. I had Darren McFadden. I saw a player or a person in our league who had Adrian Peterson. He didn't have any wideouts, so I gave him a wideout in McFadden, and I got Peterson. And Peterson exploded. He had that just phenomenal season that he had. And then the next year, the person who traded me, Peterson, panicked, and he wanted Peterson back, and he freaked out. So he just threw me talent back, and he gave me Darren McFadden back. He gave me another wideout, not the wideout I gave him. And then he got Peterson, and Peterson was a dud the next year as he ended up getting injured, I believe. But he just panicked. He tried to overmanage, overtrade his team, constantly trying to make too many moves and do too many things. And I think the biggest detriment that you can make to your fantasy team is kind of panicking, is saying, oh, something's wrong. I need to make a huge trade. I see that one a lot. Sometimes if you have a lacking wide receiver position or you need a second running back, you can find it in free agency. You don't have to make a huge franchise-changing trade. You don't have to go out and trade your star players away to get that talent to fill in those holes. Be patient. It's fine to have a weak position for a little bit. It'll develop. You can find free agents. Once again, don't overmanage your team. Don't outplay yourself. You got anything to say to that, Rob?
No, I mean, yeah, obviously you got to be aggressive in free agents like we said, but you also have to be patient. You got to use wisdom, and don't panic. That's the biggest thing. Don't hit that panic button. Mm-hmm. Last year in the Keeper League, I ended up winning it last year, the whole thing, and it's a competitive league with a bunch of guys, and at one point I week after week, Yahoo kept saying I was supposed to win. I kept putting out good lineups, and I started the year 2-5. And I was tempted to hit the panic button, but I kept going back to the fact that I felt like, you know what, these are talented guys. Maybe it's a scheduling issue, whatever it is. Let's stick to the plan that I had. Let's stick to the players that I had. Went on a roll, won the rest of my games, won 10 in a row, and won the championship once again. Be aggressive, but don't panic. Be wise.
Well, that's the thing. Don't panic. That's a little bit easier said than done. I believe your chances of making playoffs when you started 2-5, the computer had you projected like 8% chance to make playoffs. I mean, that's a time a lot of people want to panic, but if you have a good lineup, you got good players, you just trust them, roll with them, see what you can do.
Yeah.
So what's your next point? What's your next big mistake?
I think the biggest mistake people make is not learning the scoring system. If you want to be successful, get to know your scoring system. And I learned that a couple years. I think it was about 7 years ago I learned that the hard way. I'd had a lot of success in fantasy football. Won leagues, did well, but I always was in a basic, kind of a standard league scoring system. And so I got invited to be in a keeper league, but it was a PPR. And that was my first time ever being in a PPR. But you know what? I didn't pay attention to it. I really didn't study the impact of PPR and what that meant. I went into it and I thought, you know what? Fantasy football is fantasy football. What does it matter? Now, the first 2 to 3 years, I didn't have a bad team. I was right in the middle of the pack. But I started noticing that the teams in the league, they were paying a lot more attention to their wide receivers. The running backs were kind of devalued. And just their emphasis on that was a lot different. And so I started to adjust it a little bit. I looked at some things differently. Then about 3 years in, I made the adjustment. Sure enough, the following year I went on, made the playoffs. The year after that, won it again. I've been in the championship 3 years in a row. And it was just simply me overlooking the scoring system. And I'll give you an example of that. Okay. Let's take Jarvis Landry in 2015. Okay. Jarvis Landry in 2015 ended up 10th in scoring for wide receivers in PPR leagues. Okay. So 10th. But in standard leagues, he finished 30th in scoring for wideouts. That's a major change in terms of where he landed based on the different scoring systems.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Know your league, not even just your scoring systems, also just know your rules. If you're in a keeper league, draft young guys. See a lot of people drafting old players, paying tons of money or drafting Peyton Manning early. And then you know what? They're in this keeper league and a couple years later he retires and their big pick is kind of gone. And, so that's know your league, know your rules, especially your scoring. Here's something that I see a lot of people do. Huge mistake. This is probably the biggest mistake on this list that I can think of right now. And that is thinking that your last few picks aren't as important as your first few picks. That could not be a bigger mistake. And I'll tell you what, when you have the first pick in the draft, you could literally grab any cheat sheet and pick a guy who's ranked in the top 5, grab him, and boom, you've got a good player. It's hard to mess up your early picks. The first round is easy, the second round is easy, but you know what makes a difference between the bad teams, the good teams, and the great teams? Has to do with their last picks, has to do with those small players on their bench. This goes back to what we said earlier. Don't leave dead weight on your bench. You want to have talent all throughout your lineup. Those little pickups, those little moves that, last year we were in a league. Who was the last player picked up in our keeper league that we're in together? I believe it was Jordan Howard was like the last guy you went out and you just threw a buck on him.
Yeah.
And a lot of people didn't even know about him. And you know what? He turned out to be absolutely huge last year.
He was, and I actually turned around and I traded him for talent. You're right. I make my money late in the draft. A lot of times at that point, people think it doesn't matter. They're getting bored. Maybe draft's going on 2-3 hours, so they just throw names out there. I tell you what, that's where I make my money. Anybody can anybody can score a pick in the first or second round. It's not hard to decide between, do I want Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady, Le'Veon Bell or Ezekiel Elliott? You know what? But the difference maker is when you get there late in the draft. I totally agree with you. That's when it matters.
Yeah. So that's why I think that's got to be the biggest mistake that I see people make. Not just because you can get talent there, because those are the players that are going to be starting for you when you have injuries and bye weeks, and when, even another thing, maybe they take over the starting role. Maybe you threw $1 at Odell Beckham out there a couple of years ago before he exploded, and you know what? I bet you if you did that, he became your starter no matter how good your other wideouts were. He was making that starting lineup. So, like I said, just do not undervalue late picks. What about you, Rob? You're up next.
I think another mistake people make is improperly measuring the preseason. Some people, they put too much value on the preseason, and others totally ignore it. And the preseason matters to an extent. I'm going to give you an example. One, if you're looking at a veteran player who's proven himself, the preseason doesn't mean a whole lot. Obviously, they use it to get in shape, to get their feet back, to get on the same page with the quarterback, things like that. But let's say Antonio Brown or Drew Brees goes out this preseason, they struggle. I don't really care. They're going to be just fine. Okay? And so, once again, don't put too much value on it, but also don't undervalue it. Preseason is a great time to look at those that are recovering from injuries, to look at rookie progress, depth charts. And I'll give you a prime example that my first year playing fantasy football, I didn't know a whole lot, and I didn't follow conventional wisdom. I followed the preseason really closely. And there was a wide receiver out there that was really tearing it up in the preseason. Touchdown yards, he looked great. A lot of people ignored him, but I put him on my bench. I drafted him. He was like my second or third pick to the very last pick in the draft. And I threw him on my bench, and he goes on to have 119 catches, 1,781 yards, and 13 TDs, and that was Isaac Bruce. Once again, it was a great preseason that really got my attention for this young rookie. I've also seen that not just players like that, Arian Foster, Antonio Gates, Odell Beckham, and Quinn Bolden. All those were guys that if you watch their preseason, their first or second year in the league, showed that these are guys about to have breakout seasons. Once again, don't overemphasize the preseason, but definitely take notice to it. How about you, Christian? What's your next one?
I got a few more. Do you got anything more you like to talk about? We're gonna wrap this up here soon. If you have any one last point, and then we'll kind of close things out.
Yeah, I'll leave a few quitters. Another one I think mistakes people make is misplaying the matchups. Okay.
You're leaving a few quitters or quick hitters?
Quick hitters.
Okay, you gotta speak clearly.
Quick hitters. So, people misplay the matchup game. Okay. Now, first of all, going into the beginning of a year, weeks 1, 2, and 3, I don't get too worried. You're just beginning to develop trends. A lot can change in the offseason, so it's going to take a few weeks to understand defensive matchups, how they rank, how a player does. Here's the other mistake I think that people make. Too many times I've seen fantasy owners sit great players because they have a tough matchup. You'll find out, for example, that Julio Jones will play a Josh Norman or a Sherman, somebody like that, so they'll sit him. To only watch that player go on to have 100 yards and 3 TDs. Once again, there is a time and place for matchups, but keep it within the realm of reality. You're not going to sit your number one guys. Okay? Here's the other thing. If you're looking at sitting a guy, let's say a Julio Jones because he has a tough matchup, you have to honestly ask yourself, is your third wideout, that guy on your bench, your third or fourth wideout, honestly worthy to put in ahead of that guy? So once again, don't overplay the matchups. Here's another one. Don't undervalue a good kicker or defense. Once again, don't take them too early, but a good kicker or defense can help win you games. Also, remember, good football defenses don't necessarily make good fantasy defenses. And here's the other thing. Don't waste your time studying college players. You're not Mel Kiper, okay? Keep an eye on the guys that have already made it to the bigs. That's where you need to put your time and effort learning. Once again, don't worry about the guys that are in college. So those are just a few things that I think of in terms of mine. 1, check your emotions at the door. 2, don't leave dead weight on your bench. 3, during the draft, don't worry about bye weeks or the playoffs yet. 4, learn your scoring system. 5, don't make the mistake of having no draft strategy or holding too rigidly to one. 6, make sure you improperly measure the preseason. 7, don't misplay the matchup game. Christian?
Yeah, 1 was have a backup plan. You're not going to get every guy you want. 2 is draft trends. Know the league that you're in and who's going to get drafted when a running back run might go or a quarterback run might go. 3 is taking the right risks. There's a time and a place to take a chance on a star player, and there's a time not to do it. Don't overmanage. Don't outplay yourself. Don't make too many moves. Be patient with the players you have. But also remember not to sit on guys too long. That's kind of a tough balance, a little bit easier said than done. And finally, don't make the mistake of thinking your last picks don't matter. Those are the picks that make all the difference in the world. All right, so that's our video. That's our advice. If you follow these instructions and you avoid these mistakes closely, You might not win your league every year, but I tell you what, you're going to give yourself the best possible chance to make playoffs and to win that league. You still have to do your research, you still have to know players, and you still have to do the little things right. But you know what? These is a really good place to start. What do you got? Anything more to say, Rob?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Once again, as we wrap things up here, certainly enjoyed fantasy football. I'm excited for this football season. I can't wait to have that week 1. I think September 17th is that Sunday. Or September 10th is that Sunday when the first games kick off. But it's so important to remember this is just a game. As much as we love fantasy football, our real passion, my real passion, is my Lord and Savior Christ Jesus. And so I would really be making a mistake if I didn't take an opportunity to encourage you to consider making Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior once again. We love football, but even more than that, we love our Lord and Savior. And so I like to always leave that at the very end of this video. Anything you want to close with, Christian?
No, you about hit it on the head there. Let's praise Jesus, man. He's the reason we're able to play this game. Once again, we thank you guys for watching. You have a great day. God bless.